Okay, let's look at some of the ecological consequences of these positive interactions, either mutualism or commensalism, and how they can increase the growth, survival, and reproduction of interacting species. The first one's looking at Drosophila survivorship in the larval, or no, fertility. In Drosophila, as it relates to parasitism from a nematode. And it turns out if they have a bacterial symbiont in populations with the parasitic nematode, individuals with those symbionts have more eggs in their ovaries compared to the parasitized individuals without this bacterial symbiont. Often nematodes attack the reproductive organs in their parasitized species, and then in unparasitized populations, arguably there's a small decrease in fertility for individuals with that symbiont, but not nearly as dramatic of a change as when we have a symbiont that has compared to populations with the bacterial symbiont, which really protects the Drosophila from this nematode parasite, and you can measure that in the fitness of Drosophila. So when they have the symbiotic bacteria, they're protected from parasitism by this nematode. If they don't have that symbiotic bacteria, they're heavily parasitized and they have very few young. And there's some cost to that in the absence of the parasite, but that cost outweighs the benefit of when that parasite does occur. This other examples, ants living on an acacia tree. And this is a pretty interesting one where the ants really protect the acacia tree, and ants of a similar species act differently, and acacia trees without these ants also behave differently. But the ants live in the large thorns on the tree and feed on the nectar and high protein that's produced by the tree. In exchange, the ant workers patrol the tree 24 hours a day and attack anything that comes to either chew on the plant or any other competitor. So they're like these vicious attack guards for the acacia tree. And then so the acacia tree produces these nectaries where it produces food for these ants. I believe these ants are only found on this acacia tree. And so there's a benefit from the ants, they're getting food, and there's a benefit for the acacia tree that they have this mobile, really mean protection force. And so they've done a couple experiments to look at this, and in one, they removed the ants from some acacia trees and compared them to trees with ants. And acacias with ant colonies weighed over 14 times as much as trees without, and had higher survival rates and were attacked less frequently by insect herbivores. And generally, acacias without ant colonies were killed by herbivores in 6 to 12 months, and the ants can't survive without the tree. So both species have evolved unusual characteristics that benefit the other species. The ant-acacia partnership is an example of an obligate and co-evolved mutualism. So the ants only survive on this acacia tree, so they're obligate to that acacia tree. And without the ants, the acacia trees are 14 times smaller. That's crazy. And generally get eaten in 6 to 12 months. And so this trees not surviving 6 to 12 months, or more than 6 to 12 months, is due to herbivory, either other insect herbivores or mammal herbivores just eating them down. And so without these ants, they're really in trouble. Ants only live on the acacia tree, and so over time they've evolved to have this mutualistic relationship, and in fact the ants are obligate to that acacia tree. When one species provides another with a favorable habitat, it influences the distribution of that species, i.e. corals and algal symbionts. The algal symbionts are frequently found within that coral. It's opening up more areas for that coral to grow. The hot spring grasses can only live in those areas with a fungal symbiont, is another example of that. So often it's opening up new spaces that if they're not in those new spaces, they could have less competition and then greater survivorship. I just said that. I went the wrong way. Groups of dominant species, such as trees in a community, determine the distributions of other species by providing habitat. You can also think about this like the kelp forest example as well. And these positive interactions allow one species to have a larger distribution than it otherwise would. And many plants and animals are found only in forests, can't tolerate conditions or competitors in other habitats. The rocky intertidal is probably one of the best examples of facilitation. In the rocky intertidal, we talked about semibalanus and thalamus, but in that kind of zonation that happens, looking at realized niche versus a potential niche, but our fundamental niche. But there's another really important interaction as well, which is everything in the intertidal is really driven by, you can use that thalamus-balanus example of the lower tide limit of thalamus being limited by semi, I keep calling it balance. It used to be called balance, now it's semi-balance. But the lower limit being driven by semi-balance, because if thalamus lives lower on the tide line, it gets out-competed. And then thalamus can live higher on the tide line because it can withstand desiccation, drying out, better than semi-balance can. And so that's one example of the upper limit of a species being driven by physical stress and tolerance to desiccation, to drying out at low tide, and the lower limit being driven by biological factors, in this case competition, but frequently predators or the driver for the low tide line. One way that organisms get around this is by facilitation, where many species live under the strands of, and this is talking about seaweed, which creates a cool, moist environment. Barnacles are kind of a harder example to invoke this. I typically think of it a lot with limpets. So if you go out to a rocky intertidal and you start crawling around and you're looking for limpets or maybe chitons, limpets are, they're all gastropods. Chitons aren't, they're polypocophoria, but limpets are effectively like a snail, but with just one kind of dome-shaped shell over it. And they crawl around and they scrape algae off rocks. At low tide, you typically don't see them sitting out on the top of rocks. Sometimes you will, but it depends on the species. But you typically find them underneath rocks and nooks and crannies, and you can also find them underneath algae. So they can move higher up the tide line, where they're less likely to be eaten by sea stars and other predators, but they don't dry out and die because they can crawl underneath the seaweed. So at low tide, that seaweed's on top of the limpet. The sun is shining, it might heat up and dry out the seaweed, but the limpet's underneath and it's still moist and cool. So that's one example of how facilitation can change the interaction in the intertidal and actually drive species distributions up the tide line. So if you were to remove all of the seaweed off a rocky intertidal beach, you would expect the average distribution of limpets to go down because they don't have that seaweed to facilitate them moving higher on the tide line. Now, is there a benefit to the seaweed? Probably not. But it's still an important thing for the limpet. So it could be a commensal relationship. You could think of it that way. where the seaweed's not really getting benefit from the limpets, but the limpets are driving benefit from the seaweed. So in that case, it'd be a facultative commensal relationship, where the seaweed's facilitating the limpets occupying a new habitat higher on the tide line, and the seaweed really aren't getting much out of it. And positive interactions can influence community composition. This is something I never really thought of, like the overall impact of cleaner fish. And so this is probably something we're familiar with, like Blue Planet type things of these cleaner fish that set up cleaning stations. Sometimes they're shrimp, but they service usually larger fish that come by that could very well eat them. And instead they let the cleaner fish come in and eat all the parasites off the fish, and then sometimes they'll even like line up and just like wait their turn, like going through a car wash. And then the cleaner fish, eats all the parasites, which is their primary source of food. The food actually comes to them because the parasite-laden fish come to them and wait their turn. And then the fish with the parasites has a benefit of the parasites getting eaten off. So it's a really interesting example of a mutualistic relationship. And they did this study. I was trying to figure out when it was, because I'm kind of surprised. In 2003, that's relatively recent, where they removed cleaner fishes from a number of coral reefs and then tracked them over time to see what would happen. In this case, after 18 months, there was a big change in diversity and the number of fish on reefs without cleaners. And so they're attributing this to that increased parasitic load that would ultimately lead to lower survival of these fish in the absence of a cleaner fish. And so if we look at two neighboring coral reefs, one with a cleaner fish and one without, the coral reef with the cleaner fish, again, the cleaner fish has only been removed for 18 months, has about 9 species, and the one without a cleaner fish has about 5 or so. And the overall number of fish, and so independent of the species, just looking at the number of fish, which can be a good proxy for biomass, the ones with the cleaner fish had over 80 fish, where the coral reefs without a cleaner fish had under 20. So a huge impact by this one little species you might not think much of. It's like a Blue Planet, like nature documentary, like, oh, isn't this like interesting? There's this little fish where this big fish could clearly just swallow him up. But instead he chooses to let a fish that was normally about the size and shape of something he would like to eat. Instead they just sit there and let this little fish crawl around in their mouth and in their gills and eat off parasites. But in fact, there is a massive benefit for the fish that are having these parasites removed. We can look at a large-scale field experiment where the species of mycorrhizal fungi were manipulated. And they had soils with different numbers of fungal species, and then seed them with 15 different plants, and then looked at both the phosphorus uptake in the plant and the biomass of these plants as a measure of looking at what's the role of mycorrhizal fungi in these environments. And so there's a series of plots that are all starting with similar conditions with the exception of the number of mycorrhizal fungi. They're all getting the same growing conditions, and they all start off with the same suite of 15 different species. We can look at shoot biomass, root biomass, and phosphorus content of the plant. And so in the plots with 0 mycorrhizal fungi, biomass was relatively low, 75 or so grams per meter squared. And there's kind of a maximum of about 8 mycorrhizal fungi. The benefits start to taper off. But you have much more growth, about 50% more growth really at 120 grams per meter squared. Root biomass, pretty similar. With 0 mycorrhizal fungi, you're 85-ish again. That's about 75. And then you're maxing out at about 140. So again, about a 50% increase in root biomass with the addition of at least 8 mycorrhizal fungi. This is the phosphorus content, and so how much phosphorus do the plants have within their tissue. And again, about 1,000 milligrams per meter squared of phosphorus in plant tissue, and that number rose to about 1,700 or so. So that's a larger increase with 8 macrorhizal fungi, and still some increase with 14. I'm going to talk about a slightly different example, but it is pretty similar to the yucca story, although it's a bit different. So I have the sound off for this. It's not really, the sound isn't really that useful anyway. It's just some, in this case, Canadians talking about what they're seeing and not really understanding the circle of life. But this is on Pender Island. Pender's just across the border. It's one of the Canadian, they don't like it to be referred this way, but one of the Canadian Gulf Islands. But it's a group of islands just directly across the border. So from Bellingham, as the crow flies, this is only 20, 30 miles away. It's just north of Pender's kind of one of the southern Gulf Islands. So it's just north of San Juan, kind of. Let me mute it so you don't hear through here. But here's a bald eagle swimming ashore, and we missed the video came in after it started, but they were talking about, they thought this bald eagle was fighting, and as we see it swim ashore. The video's a bit grainy here, but you can see it swimming ashore, and then it has something, and now it's pulled it ashore, and it will begin. Let's see, it's going to drag it over there. What it has is a great blue heron, and it plucked it out of the sky, so it bombed it when it was flying through the air, and then in a second here it'll proceed to start to consume it. Let's see, there he goes. So apologies for the camera work, but here he's starting to pluck it, and then he'll go through and start eating it. So bald eagles eat blue herons. There's an example of a bald eagle eating a blue heron. This article from Hackeye, which is, I tend not to present popular press articles, but Hackeye is quite good, and they do hire a lot of good scientists to work there. They wrote an article with a interesting title, "Sleeping with the Enemy," and what they're doing is they're reporting on work in British Columbia, looking at the distribution of blue heron colonies and bald eagles. And they found that blue heron colonies, which can be quite large, they can have I think it's 400 or so members in a colony. Yep. So you'll have this colony of blue herons, and there's a bald eagle nest right there. Now, we just saw that bald eagle will eat heron. So why are they setting up a nest so close to the bald eagle? And it turns out it's kind of similar to the yucca moth laying its eggs in the yucca, and those eggs hatching and eating some of the seeds. They eat some of them, but not all of them. Bald eagles tend to be very territorial, and so if you look at a blue heron colony away from a bald eagle nest, it's open season effectively for them. All of the local bald eagles can come in there and with impunity start pecking away and eating the blue herons. Now, if the blue herons set up their nest adjacent to the bald eagle nest, when another bald eagle comes by, they'll chase off that bald eagle because they're territorial. Now, that bald eagle may consume a few of the blue herons, but it won't eat them all. And so the question is, would you rather have an enemy that eats some of your young, or would you rather, and protects you from the other enemies, the other bald eagles, or would you rather be out on your own and have to face all of the bald eagles without any protection? And so there's clearly a benefit here, and you could argue it's a mutualistic benefit, where the blue herons are deriving some benefit of being by the bald eagles, otherwise they wouldn't do it. And that benefit, protection from other bald eagles, outweighs the cost. In this case, the cost is lost fledgling or lost young to those bald eagles. And the bald eagles get some benefit. There's some tasty blue herons nearby that they can eat, and there's not really any other cost to them. They're getting the benefit of being able to eat blue herons that are close by. Blue herons are getting the benefit of protection from other bald eagles, and their cost being they're losing some of their young to these bald eagles. So it's an interesting mutualistic relationship, and it's interesting to think about what are the costs and benefits in this mutualistic relationship. And you could phrase it like, how do bald eagles and blue herons form a mutualistic relationship? What are the costs and benefits to each of them? And the cost of the blue heron being they're going to lose some young, but the benefit being they'll be protected from other bald eagles, so they're likely to lose less young being near a nesting bald eagle than they would be further away from that nesting bald eagle, where they are effectively in no man's land, and they'll be subject to predation by all of the bald eagles instead of just one nest of bald eagles. And to the bald eagles, they have a benefit of being able to eat blue herons, and there's no real cost associated with it. So it's a bit of a different mutualistic relationship than we normally think of, where you're deriving benefit by setting your nest up in the same tree as one of your primary predators. But nonetheless, there you have it. So that'll wrap up chapter 15.